The 1990s are widely considered as the golden era of the JRPG, with games like Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Earthbound, though not considered a success at the time, would go on later to find cult classic status years later, and Final Fantasy VI. Even now, those games from that early 90s JRPG era are considered timeless classics and the foundational blueprints of games that we know and love today. So, funnily enough, I was having a conversation with my friend Super Derek the other day on what makes JRPGs great, and I mentioned that Final Fantasy VI is a bit of a mixed bag and maybe not all it's meant to be. So here's what I said. For a game like Final Fantasy VII, and I know a thought like this has been repeated time and time again, but I think you had to be there to really understand the gravity of it. Same thing with Final Fantasy VI. This is something that I'm going to make a video of why I don't like Final Fantasy VI. I think it's a good game, but I don't think it's a great game. But I think you had to be there to truly experience it for what it was when it was, rather than what it is, if that makes sense. Now, I did get some really great replies backing my standpoint and some questioning it with some really well thought out replies. So I wanted to make a standalone video on how I really feel about Final Fantasy VI and why. So this video isn't meant to be a review, but let's quickly summarize what Final Fantasy VI is. Final Fantasy VI is a game that some see as Square, the game developers, finest piece of work. This was the last 2D sprite-based game in the series prior to departing in favor of a 3D style, starting with Final Fantasy VII, which came after Final Fantasy VI, of course. At the time when this was released in 1994, there would have been nothing quite like this on the Super Nintendo, taking full advantage of the system's hardware to create a game that still even now is considered beautiful and imaginative given the restrictions. Plus the great use of Mode 7 to give the world map a more lively feel. One of the most interesting things is that this game only took 1 year to complete. Some say great stories write themselves, and I think that's exactly what happened here. The game starts with the classic scene of Terra, riding in Magitek armor, with 2 members of the Imperial Force on a quest to invade Narshe to find an Esper frozen in ice. This here is probably the most iconic opening scene from a game ever, backed with the amazing opening theme underlying. Truly, you're inhuman here if you don't get chills while watching this thinking, what could be in store for me here? From here, you'll find different characters with different backstories, explore some of those backstories while following the main quest, which is somewhat linear until the later half of the game. It's likely you even miss some characters during your initial playthrough, especially if you're not using a guide or don't necessarily feel motivated to seek out each and every one of the 14 playable characters. Final Fantasy VI is a great tale of good versus evil, with probably the most sinister bad guy in video game history. A maniacal madman whose thirst for blood gets worse as the game goes on. You can literally see Kefka become more and more ruthless and just kill for the sake of killing, a true force to be reckoned with. There's a lot of cool elements here, specifically with Espers, the summons of the game, having more of a story than just being implemented as summons or extra magic powers, giving them a home world, their own reasons for fighting, and a huge spoiler here if you haven't played this game, Terra, one of the main characters, being half Esper, half human. Graphically, it's really great and has aged really well. As I mentioned before, it makes use of Mode 7 with the overworld map while either flying or running on a chocobo. This game has been ported to different platforms, but it's always going to look best on the Super Nintendo while played on a CRT. I don't care what anybody says. The music is incredibly timeless and transcends the game in my opinion. Everything the series composer Nobuo Uematsu writes is classic, especially from this time period, with tons of great themes, but most notably the song Dancing Mad, which wouldn't be out of place on a 1970s Genesis, Emerson, Lake & Palmer, or even a Yes album with so many different tempo shifts, feels, emotions, and phrasings. It truly is a monolith of a song. I know I don't talk a whole lot about video game music here, but I will say, coming from a progressive rock background, listening to bands like Yes and Rush, among others growing up, I feel like I understand the series' musical motivations maybe more so than the average Joe. And I'm sure that there's some music buffs here in the comments section who might actually agree, so drop me a line down below. The music takes full advantage of the Super Nintendo hardware, with the songs having that classic early 90s feel and even taking an operatic direction in some points. I think what they were able to do here is incredibly impressive and again transcends the game in my opinion to become something standalone that can be listened to without reference for what the game is, or even having never played it before. And because the game precedes Final Fantasy VII, I found some of the music oddly nostalgic here, having never played most of the game until recently. Some sound effects are also super similar to Chrono Trigger here as well. I really enjoy this era of games the most, so anytime I play any 16-bit JRPG, I'm always right at home. With all that being said, here's my issue with Final Fantasy VI. I will say, I've played the game before, I've beaten the game before, I've attempted to play the game probably about 5 or 6 times over the last 10 years, and every single time I play it, I find that I cannot connect with the story, I cannot connect with the characters, I cannot connect with the world, I can connect with the music, but that's literally it. I think, personally, there's too much happening here. The idea of multiple characters in the game is really cool, but I find that I really couldn't vibe with anybody other than Edgar, the king of Figaro. The story is a great story. It's a classic timeless tale of good versus evil, a bad guy who completely destroys the world, and it's undone by the main characters by the end of the game. But I think where it falls short is the delivery. I feel like there's way too many what-ifs and story elements that either I glossed over in all of my playthroughs, or I couldn't find, or they weren't fleshed out enough, or perhaps the translation wasn't as thorough as the Japanese one. I mean, again, you can literally miss so many things if you're playing through blind without a guide, which leads you to have to play the game multiple times just to try and fill in gaps along the way that you may have missed, and you may not even know that you missed these things. One good example of the story falling short is General Leo. I thought that General Leo was being set up to be teased as a playable character later in the game. You first see General Leo at a camp, and then you eventually board a ship with General Leo after hearing about him and seeing him a couple of times, and then I think in conversation with whoever the main character is at the time, basically he says, you know, he has a heart, he has a family, he wants to go back to his family, he's starting to question what the Empire is doing. And then all of a sudden he dies. I feel like it was such a wasted opportunity for somebody within the bad side to turn against them and really want to take down the bad guy. And I feel like it was a missed opportunity. And I know a lot of people say that this is a tragic event that's happened in Final Fantasy VI, and maybe thematically so. Maybe that's supposed to tug at your heartstrings. But for me, it was just kind of like, oh, that kind of sucks. Like I wanted to like this dude. I wanted to have him in my party. I wanted him to be the guy that landed the final hit on Kefka at the end of the game. But instead, he just gets killed really early. And seemingly for no reason. But I guess that lends its hand into the fact that Kefka is just an incredibly well-written bad guy. You know what I mean? He literally just shows up and kills people for seemingly no reason. But I mean, that's fine. That's his character trait. But it still keeps the gears turning for me on the what-ifs. Now, out of the 14 playable characters, some of them kind of fell short in their delivery. And some of those characters are Setzer, who really only seems to be there for the sake of the party getting the airship. There is some backstory before you get the first ship and then the second ship in the World of Ruin, but are his story elements just literally here for the sake of getting ships? Shadow, one of my favorite characters of the game, a mysterious ninja who pops in and out as he pleases, only becoming a mainstay in the game after the World of Ruin, if you were even able to rescue him. I had no idea. I think he's really cool, but maybe the mystique and appeal of Shadow is how little he's featured. I like him, I really do, but I wanted to know even more. Realm. Backing off of Shadow, who is implied to be her father, Realm was one of the last living people in a town of magic users. I felt her inclusion wasn't really a huge addition to the game, as once her and Strogo came into the picture, I was pretty set on my party. But I can understand the addition there because of the implications of Shadow possibly being Realm's father. You can also argue about the overall character arcs here. I feel like they're kind of non-existent, with only Terra's backstory being truly fleshed out, having her transformations and lineage explained. I think the best way Final Fantasy VI is meant to be played is by playing through the game multiple times, checking out different characters and exploring the world more and more each time. There's so many different scenarios that you can miss. For example, just mentioning Shadow, you can totally miss him straight away if you're not paying attention sitting at the bar with his dog. Though the NPCs do tell you about him, you can be totally oblivious and miss him. Same goes for when Kefka destroys the world. You can outright miss Shadow boarding your ship if you don't know you have to wait until the last second. Guilty as charged. Ultimately, my issue with Final Fantasy VI comes down to two things: linearity and being spoiled for choice. I usually like to play my games as straight as an arrow and as easy as possible. Now, I do realize a lot of newer games have implemented things such as like story modes, casual modes. The point that I'm at in my life, I'm usually incredibly tired, and I just want to chill when I play a game. All right. And I realized a game 30 years ago did not have a feature like that. There is this thing as a classic JRPG grind, and I do appreciate that. But every time that I've gone to play Final Fantasy VI, I just feel like I'm not in the right headspace. And maybe that, again, that might be on me. I mean, you can play the game as straight as an arrow. You can play the game as quickly as possible with a core party of only, 4 people, and not swap out characters and not swap out party members, and go through the game as basically as possible until you need to do late game grind, which is just going to stop you super short from finishing off Kefka at Kefka's Tower. Oftentimes when I played through the game, I found I just wanted to give up because it became too difficult because of the way that I was playing the game. So that's an issue with me. I mentioned being spoiled for choice, and I mean it. I genuinely don't like it. When a game presents you with so many different outcomes and so many different characters, for example, one specific thing, when in the world of Ruin, when you go to Narsh, right, and all the doors are locked, there's nobody there, you can go into one specific item shop, the guy behind the counter offers you an item, and he says, do you want to keep the stone or you want to turn the stone into a sword? And I was like, oh my god, there's like a game-breaking decision I need to make here. It's either I get the Ragnarok or I get the item that I can equip that will give me Ultima, right? I can teach Ultima to every individual party member, or I can have possibly one of the best swords in the game. Now, I did end up picking the stone, but this was after much deliberation here on my couch, reading many forums, saying, oh my god, I've got to make this huge choice. And I even got my wife in on the discussion, probably much to her dismay. Like, am I going to make the right choice or not? So I find it just added an extra level of anxiety. And I had the same issue when I played Chrono Cross, because it's like, this is a different discussion for a different game. But when a game spoils you with so much choice and different outcomes, it's just like, I honestly can't handle it, because I just want to play through the game once. I want my experience to be encapsulated. And I don't want to think, oh my god, I missed out on this, or oh my gosh, I should have done this. I really want to love this game. I truly respect what it was then back in 1994 and what it is now in 2021. It's a masterpiece and a masterclass in great games and JRPGs, and even good stories too. I think it's unfortunate, but my heart just cannot grab onto this game. Out of all the times that I've tried to play it and all the years of attempts and eventually clearing the game and beating the game, I can say this, having beaten the game, that I just cannot understand the hype of Final Fantasy VI. So to answer the question posed in the title of this video, is Final Fantasy VI a bad game? Not at all. Not at all. And I think it's one of the best games of all time. I think my stance and standpoint of the game boils down to my play preferences and my personal time to invest in games. If I was a single guy back in 1994, I mean, technically I was only a year old, but I guess I was a single guy, as an adult with no responsibilities. Or for example, like a kid coming home from school to come and play Super Nintendo after quickly doing homework, I think it would be perfect, a perfect adventure. But I think the season of life I have been in every single time I try to play this game, I just can't click with it. Therefore, it's hindered my ability to truly love Final Fantasy VI in the way that I want to. I truly believe that Final Fantasy VI was way ahead of its time with what it was trying to accomplish, and may have even bit off more than it can chew as a result. Or am I just a bad person for going into the game every single time expecting an unadulterated masterpiece and coming away feeling that it was less than what it was hyped up to be? I don't know. I'll let you decide.